Beckett Hale's acceptance speech died in his throat the moment he spotted her, near the entrance of the Fairmont's Grand Ballroom. Imani Darko stood at the edge of the crowd wearing a deep burgundy dress that moved, like she'd designed it herself. Which, knowing Imani, she probably had. She wasn't watching the stage, she wasn't watching him. Her eyes were tracking someone moving through the sea of architects and developers and city councilors in evening wear. And when Beckett followed her gaze, his fingers tightened around the crystal award in his hand. Cyrus Lamont. The man whose signature on a federal heritage contract could reshape a career, or end one. The man who'd announced 3 weeks ago that his foundation was pouring $42 million into a national urban renewal initiative, the largest private investment in Canadian architecture in a generation. "Baby," Gemma Whitmore murmured at his side, her hand resting on his arm. "You went pale, are you all right?" "Fine," Beckett said. "Just I didn't expect her to be here." Gemma glanced toward the entrance. "Who is that?" "Nobody," he said, and immediately knew it was the wrong word. Imani was never nobody. 3 years earlier their firm had operated out of a converted loft on Queen Street West, 12-foot ceilings, original brick, the smell of drafting paper and cold coffee and possibility. Darko Hale Design. Her name first because she'd been practicing 2 years longer and she'd said, half joking, that it sounded better alphabetically. He'd kissed her on the top of her head and agreed. They'd met at Ryerson during their master's program, fallen in love over site plans and structural debates, built a practice together that was scrappy and small and genuinely, stubbornly good. Imani was the one who could see inside a building before it existed, who would stand in an empty lot in the dead of a February in Winnipeg and describe exactly how light would move through a corridor 3 years from now, in a way that made contractors put down their coffees and listen. The Aurora Community Centre had been her idea from the first sketch. A project in East Vancouver, a commission from a neighborhood association that barely had a budget. They'd taken it on a shoestring. Imani had worked through Christmas that year. She'd built the passive air cycling system from first principles, redesigned the roofline 4 times until it caught winter light exactly the way she wanted. She'd drafted half the drawings herself because they couldn't yet afford a full CAD team. When the project was complete, an architecture critic from the Globe wrote that the Aurora Centre was the kind of building that makes you believe cities can still care about their people, and he attributed it to the young firm Darko Hale Design. The client presentation for the sister project had been different. Beckett had taken that meeting alone. Imani was in Vancouver doing a final site walkthrough, a scheduling conflict genuinely unavoidable, and the developers behind the Aurora Centre's expansion had flown in from Calgary for a single afternoon. "You go," Imani had told him. "You know the design, you can do this." He did know the design, he'd watched her build it. When she came back to Toronto and read the project brief that went out to the Calgary developers, she noticed it said, Principal Architect Beckett Hale. She brought it up quietly, over dinner. He frowned, said it was an administrative oversight, said he'd fix it. He didn't fix it. Then came the feature in Canadian Architect magazine. The profile of Beckett Hale, the mind behind the Aurora Centre's biophilic design language. Imani was mentioned once in a bracket as his partner. Beckett. She'd placed the magazine on the kitchen table between them. "This is not what we agreed to. It's one profile. These things get simplified for general readers. I designed that building. We both worked on it, Imani. I brought in the Calgary connection. I managed the client relationship for the last 8 months while you were overseeing the subtrades on site. Overseeing the subtrades on site is called building the building." He'd looked at her the way he sometimes did, like her ambition was an inconvenience he'd learned to manage. Like she was making something simple unnecessarily complicated. It kept happening. Awards submissions where his name was listed as lead. A CBC radio interview where the host asked about the inspiration behind the Aurora Centre, and Beckett talked for 7 minutes without saying her name. A speaking invitation from the Toronto chapter of the RAIC addressed to him alone, for a project they'd built together. The night Imani found the amended firm operating agreement in his desk drawer, the version that had quietly restructured credit allocation to list him as creative director and her as project coordinator. She sat in the kitchen of their Leslieville house until 3 in the morning. She made 2 cups of tea and let them both go cold. She looked at their wedding photo on the shelf above the stove and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives only in the middle of the night, that she was not in a marriage. She was in an arrangement that had been tilting against her for years without her fully noticing. When Beckett came downstairs for coffee, she slid the operating agreement across to him. He barely glanced at it. "That reflects the current division of responsibilities. It was changed without my signature. You're a co-owner. Nothing material changes until we both sign the partnership restructure. This is internal documentation. My name is in the firm name, Beckett, Darko Hale, and in every document that actually goes out the door, my name is a footnote. That's not. I want a divorce. The words sat between them like a third person in the room. You don't mean that. I've been watching this happen for 2 years, and I kept telling myself it was scheduling, it was circumstance, it was poor communication between busy people. Imani picked up the operating agreement, set it back down. It wasn't any of those things. You know exactly what you've been doing. He said things after that. That she was exhausted and reading too much into ordinary business decisions. That her contributions were recognized privately where it mattered. That a firm needed one clear public narrative, one face, one story, and she should take pride in the fact that story was built on their shared work. She didn't argue. She went upstairs, called her lawyer, and started making a list. The dissolution lawyer had been honest with her. Authorship over the Aurora Center's design was legally murky. Construction documentation attributed to both of them in shifting proportions depending on the project phase. She could fight it, but it would take years and cost more than she'd likely recover. Tell me what you actually want, the lawyer had said. Imani thought about it for a long time. Long enough that the lawyer refilled her coffee and waited. I want to be acknowledged, she said finally, eventually, when it actually matters. The clause she drafted was 11 lines buried in Schedule D of the firm dissolution agreement, under the dry heading Intellectual Property and Legacy Attribution. In the careful language of legal drafting it said, in the event that Hale Design, the renamed entity, to contract, commission or award of national significance with an associated value exceeding $25 million within 5 years of the dissolution date, 22% equity interest would transfer to Imani Darko, accompanied by mandatory public credit attribution on all projects completed during the partnership period. Beckett's lawyer had glanced at it. The firm was worth a modest amount that year, one mid-sized client, a civic project in Hamilton, a handful of residential commissions. $25 million was not a number that felt real to anyone in that room. They signed. Imani walked out of the lawyer's office on a Tuesday in November, stood on Bay Street in the kind of cold that comes off Lake Ontario and settles into the gaps of a city, and let herself feel the thing she'd been holding down for months. Not grief, not anger, something quieter than both. The feeling of a person who has placed a very careful bet and knows, with the certainty of someone who once designed a passive heating system from first principles in the middle of winter, that it will pay. Cyrus Lamont reached Imani before Beckett did. He was taller than she'd expected from photographs, early 60s, silver at his temples, wearing a suit that suggested money had never been something he'd had to think about much. He moved through the Fairmont's ballroom the way Beckett had always wanted to move, like the room had arranged itself around him without his asking. He stopped in front of her and did something she hadn't anticipated. He extended his hand formally and said, "Mrs. Darko, I've been hoping to meet you. I owe you something of an apology." She tilted her head. For what? For almost investing $42 million in a firm I didn't fully understand. He glanced toward the dais where the RAIC Awards sat beside Beckett's champagne glass. I spent 4 months reviewing Hale Design's project history before I committed. The Aurora Center kept stopping me. The structural logic was unlike anything else in their portfolio, so I went looking for where it actually came from. Imani was quiet. I found the original submission to the East Vancouver Neighborhood Association, 14 months before the project broke ground. The authoring architect's name was yours. Cyrus's voice was measured, precise. I found CAD file metadata. I found site correspondence. I found a CBC radio interview where the host asks your then husband where the biophilic concept originated, and he says, and I want to be precise here, he says, I've always been drawn to how buildings breathe. Imani made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. He pulled the passive air cycling concept directly from your second-year master's thesis, Cyrus continued, which I also found. It's in the Ryerson Digital Library, published 2013. Your name on the cover. Beckett arrived then with his media smile in place and his hand extended. Cyrus, great to see you here. I didn't realize you two had. His eyes moved between them, recalibrated. I wasn't aware you knew each other. We didn't, Cyrus said, without taking the offered hand. We do now. He turned back to Imani. I'd like to show you something before the formal program begins. Would you come with me? Beckett said her name, sharp and quiet. The way he always said it when he wanted to redirect her without appearing to. Imani looked at him, full-on unhurried. How have you been, he asked. His voice had shifted softer. Careful. Well, she said. You? Good, really good. The firm is. We're in a strong position. You've probably heard about the Federal Commission. He glanced at Cyrus, recalibrated again. It's been a tremendous year. I've always hoped we could. Beckett. She said his name the way you say a word when you finally understood what it means. We signed papers. I know that. There's a lot I'd like to say if you were open to. I'm not, she said simply and turned to follow Cyrus. The room he led her to was just off the main ballroom, one of the Fairmont's smaller function spaces, now serving as a staging area for the evening's presentations. A projection screen had been set up along one wall. Imani recognized what was on it before she was close enough to read it clearly. Her master's thesis from Ryerson, open to the page where she diagrammed the passive air cycling system. Her original hand-drawn elevations for the Aurora Centre, photographs from the Vancouver site that she had taken herself, on a camera she still owned with metadata she'd never deleted. Cyrus stood beside the screen with a woman Imani didn't recognize. 50s, close-cropped gray locks, a lanyard from the RAIC around her neck. This is Dr. Anita Ferreira, Cyrus said. She chairs the National Attribution Committee. Dr. Ferreira extended her hand. Mrs. Darko, we've been expecting you. Imani looked at the screen, at her own handwriting from a decade ago. She felt the room do something strange, compress and then expand, like a building settling into its foundation after the first winter. Beckett had followed them. Of course he had. He stood in the doorway with Gemma at his elbow, both of them reading the projection screen with very different expressions. What is this? His voice was controlled, just barely. A correction, Cyrus said. He moved toward the doorway, no aggression in it, just presence, and Beckett took a small step back. When I invest in something, I invest in the actual source of its value. I found the actual source. Those files are, the firm's portfolio is a collaborative body of work. Attribution is always more complicated than. Is it? Dr. Ferreira asked pleasantly. Because the metadata on these original files is quite straightforward. Whatever clause Imani put in that dissolution agreement, it isn't enforceable. Our lawyers have already reviewed it, Imani said. 3 different firms. I had them review it when I drafted it. The silence in the room was the particular silence of a person realizing they should have read more carefully. Out in the main ballroom, the host was calling guests to their seats. Through the doors came the sound of 200 architects settling in for an evening that was about to go differently than any of them had planned. Dr. Ferreira moved toward the doors. We have a correction to make to this evening's attribution presentation. Ms. Darko, the RAIC would like to present the Aurora Center's design recognition to its actual principal architect. With your permission. Imani stood still for a moment. She thought about the Tuesday in November, the cold on Bay Street, the particular quality of knowing privately, without needing anyone else to confirm it, that you have placed the right bet. Yes, she said. She walked to the podium with Cyrus on one side and Dr. Ferreira on the other, while the room shifted and murmured and leaned toward each other with questions. On the screens behind her, her original drawings appeared, her hand, her drafting, her thesis diagrams, her site photographs. I want to say something brief, Imani said into the microphone. The room went quiet with the particular attention that arrives when people sense they are about to witness something they will still be talking about at next year's gala. I didn't come here tonight to collect anything. Cyrus Lamont reached out to me this week and asked if I would be present for an announcement. I didn't know the details, I'm still catching up. She looked at the projection behind her. At the roofline she'd redrawn 4 times. I built the Aurora Community Centre. I designed the passive air cycling system, the roofline, the biophilic concept, the structural integration. I did this as part of a firm that carried my name on its door, but my name stopped appearing on most things fairly quickly after that. A pause. Buildings don't lie. The Aurora Centre is still standing in East Vancouver doing exactly what I designed it to do. That is the record. I'm grateful to Cyrus for looking closely enough to find it. She stepped back from the microphone. And Cyrus Lamont, who had listened to every word of it from 3 feet away, leaned in and pressed his lips to her cheek. Quiet and deliberate, in front of 200 people and a room full of projection screens still holding her drawings. Not a performance, a statement. The kind a person makes when they have decided to be honest about which side of something they are on and are not embarrassed about it. When he straightened, he said, low enough for only her. That was 3 years overdue. The room was already moving. A journalist in the 3rd row typing. 2 men near the bar that Imani recognized as Beckett's primary client contacts, their faces arranged in the careful blankness of people who are recalculating. Beckett found her near the exit. Imani. The careful quality was gone from his voice, something rawer underneath. We can talk about this, the attribution, the equity transfer, it doesn't have to go this way. Whatever Cyrus told you. Cyrus didn't tell me anything I didn't already know, she said. I wrote the code, Beckett. I drew the lines. I redesigned the roofline 4 times in December, when it was cold enough to see your breath in the loft. I know exactly what the Aurora Centre is worth because I built it. There are lawyers involved now. This could get complicated. It's already settled. Dr. Ferreira's committee will correct the public record. Your lawyer will receive the equity transfer documents this week. That's all. And the firm. Still yours. She looked at him the way you look at something you have been holding and have finally decided to set down. I don't want your firm, Beckett. I never did. I want my name on the work I did. I want the record to be accurate. I want people who study this building in 20 years to know who designed it. She put her hand on the door. That's the whole bet. That's all it ever was. You planned this, he said, from the beginning. The clause? I protected myself. After you made it clear I needed to. She held the door for a moment. You told me a firm needs one clear vision, one story. You were right about that. It turned out I just had the better story. She walked out into the Fairmont's lobby, where November air was pushing in cold through the revolving doors, and Cyrus fell into step beside her without being asked. What happens now? Imani said. Now the record reflects who actually designed the most written about community building in Western Canada in the last decade. He held the outer door open, and you go back to doing what you do, designing things, solving problems, making buildings that make critics say cities can still care about their people. Except now, every time someone writes that sentence, they know it's you. She stepped out onto Front Street. Toronto was loud and lit and indifferent the way it always was. Hundreds of buildings reaching above her, each one the result of somebody's specific, irreplaceable thinking. Somewhere across the country, in East Vancouver, a roofline she had redrawn 4 times was catching the last light of the Pacific evening, exactly as she'd always known it would. She breathed in the cold. It felt like arriving somewhere she had never actually left. If this story found something in you, let me know in the comments what moment hit hardest. And subscribe to Bravsoul Stories TV, because this is what happens when the truth finally has nowhere left to hide.